If you've ever been around this place for years or decades, maybe you probably know this story, but it is one that bears repeating. The 19th century Julia Ward Howe Unitarian lay leader, who perhaps ironically is best known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was also a celebrated poet and dedicated peace activist in the second half of the 19th century. She traveled in influential circles. She worked tirelessly for women's suffrage, for the abolition of slavery, for prison and education reform. And during the Franco-Prussian War, she became a pacifist after she'd written that stirring anthem. Her niece once described her like this: Aunt Julia, she said, was a small woman of no particular shape or carriage, clothes never quite taken care of, her bonnets never quite straight on her head, and yet there was about her presence an unforgettable distinction and importance. Her speaking voice was very beautiful, her face had a sensitive gravity, a look of compassionate wisdom, until a twinkle of fun rippled over it and a naughty imp laughed in her eyes. So I think of that twinkle and that naughty imp when I hear these words that she wrote in 1870 when she proclaimed the first Mother's Day for peace, the origin of this holiday that has become something quite different, but for her was a call to action. This is part of that proclamation. She said, "Again have the skill and power of two great nations exhausted themselves in mutual murder. Again have the sacred questions of international justice been committed to the fatal mediation of military weapons. In this day of progress, in this century of light," she said, "the ambition of rulers has been allowed to barter the dear interests of domestic life for the bloody exchanges of the battlefield. Thus men have done, thus men will do, but women need no longer be made a party to proceedings which fill the globe with grief and horror. Despite the assumptions of physical force, the mother has a sacred and commanding word to say to the sons who owe their life to her suffering. That word should now be heard and answered to as never before. Arise, then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. She called for an international Congress of Women, one that never came to fruition, but I think her call still rings clear today. I celebrated Mother's Day then the traditional way yesterday with my mom by attending a vigil in San Francisco with other interfaith clergy and many others who gathered to mourn the death of Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian journalist who was killed 2 years ago, murdered by a sniper of the Israeli Defense Force, and the over 140 other Palestinian journalists who've been killed over the last 7 months. As we solemnly process down by the wharf, along by the ferry building, and down to the arrow sculpture, following a coffin with her name and with everyone in the procession holding the names of those journalists slain, it was a beautiful, if hard and heavy, ritual. It was beautiful to be together in silence, to hold care, hold despair in community together. And as we processed, there were a couple of people who called out in what I can only call immature reactivity. People who were so unsettled in themselves that with what all going on in the world, this is what they could muster to shout out at this solemn, quiet procession of clergy. The first yelled out, quite disturbingly, "Hitler was right. Heil Hitler." And then just a few moments later, someone called out, "Bring back the hostages." Nothing to say but the hostages. I've been struck over these last 7 months by how much of our public conversation has been dominated by this kind of immature reactionary stance. There's a piece calling this out this week going around the internet. It's by Mo Husseini. He's a Palestinian American, lives up in the Northwest, who made 50 true statements, he said, 50 true statements, and most of them are not appropriate for church. So if you're interested, you'll have to go and read his 50 true statements, but they resonated for me. I bet they would for most of you. One of them, he said, "The solution to the Middle East conflict will not be found on threads, on social media threads, on TikTok, or in the streets of any city that isn't within a 2-hour car ride from downtown Jerusalem." But what are we to do, we who know we are implicated, we are complicit in this conflict, in these bombs that drop funded by our tax dollars? What are we to do who would wish that we could, by going to the streets, bring about peace? And instead, we watch our own community at each other's throats. I was watching the testimony of Anikia Ford Morthell, the superintendent of our Berkeley Unified School District this week, called to testify before Congress about the challenges to address anti-Semitism here in our community. And I just think we're fighting about the wrong thing. And I just think it's a waste of our superintendent's time to be called before Congress to speak about this when she could be working on the many, many needs that I know many of you are working on to address inequality in our Berkeley schools. So the question I've been asking myself, the question that I don't feel like I have a good answer to as I read what people have to write and engage with their actions, is what is it that we are doing that perpetuates the cycle of violence, and what is it that liberates us from it? How do we know? When we're advocating for children in our schools, when we're speaking out to free Palestine, how do we know what helps liberate from the cycle of violence and what only perpetuates it? John Paul Lederach is an international consultant for peace negotiations. He's worked in areas of the most severe conflict around the world for many decades. He's a Mennonite and one of the preeminent scholars teaching peace building at Eastern Mennonite University's prestigious program. He would begin each graduate seminar in his peace building course with this question: how does social change actually happen? And over the years, he concluded, I have come to intuit more than scientifically prove, to feel more than quantify, that the center of building sustainable justice and peace is the quality and nature of people's relationships. The transformation that he's engaged with and witnessed in places of entrenched conflict, he says it emerges not primarily from particular skills or techniques, but from the capacity to imagine new possibilities, to see in the messy web of relationships the places where there is a possible turning point, an opening for change. And so he called his book on his body of work, The Moral Imagination. And one of the stories he tells a number of stories, and one of them is the women of Wajir, an area in the northeastern part of Kenya near the Somali and Ethiopian borders. The district is mostly made up of Somali clans, and when the Somali government collapsed in 1989, the whole region was destabilized and was soon rife with fighting. And so he starts the story like this: the women of Wajir did not set out to stop a war. They just wanted to make sure they could get food for their families. The initial idea was simple enough: make sure that the market is safe enough for anyone to buy and sell. This impulse, this beautiful impulse. Decca was one of the key women leaders in Wajir. One night when shooting erupted near her house, she ran for her firstborn child and hid for several hours under her bed while bullets crisscrossed the room. Processing what had happened in the morning, her mom remembered violence from 30 years before, when Decca was a child and her mother held her under her bed. That conversation fueled a determination to find a way to make Wajir a place where her daughter would enjoy a violence-free life. Other women shared similar stories. They began to gather quietly, fewer than a dozen of them at first, working to make the market safe for them to feed their families became their focus. And so they set up a monitoring system of rotation of who would be keeping an eye on things. That developed into the Wajir's Women's Peace Association, and then their work spread to working with elders, to strategically using their relationships to find one particular elder on the council who might speak in favor of peace on their behalf, knowing that they couldn't make the voice the concerns themselves. And from there, then they realized that the youth would need to be engaged to stop the fighting, the youth who were taking up the guns themselves, and what the youth really needed were jobs. And so they engaged with the business community to find jobs for the youth. Step by step, they worked until all of these people were together in the Wajir Peace and Development Committee, which became a powerful force across communities. Guns were turned in. Emergency response team deployed. A pause in the wake of a night of terror. A conversation between mother and daughter, a space of reflection amongst a gathered community, making room for imagination, making space for a new possibility. Lederach draws out 4 capacities that he says make this kind of moral imagination possible. The first, the moral imagination requires the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. We have to see those enemies as part of the same web. Second, the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity. without reliance on dualistic polarity. Third, the fundamental belief in and pursuit of the creative act. That creativity is possible. And fourth, finally, the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar landscape of violence. It is risky to do something different. But to do otherwise is only to perpetuate that cycle of violence that we know in all families, in all nations. One last story. In 1992, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, was besieged at the center of that war that dominated the headlines of my childhood. And one day in one neighborhood of the city, the hungry citizens of the city were lined up outside one of the few bakeries to remain open when a mortar shell burst among them. And the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera, a man named Vedran Smilovic, heard the shell burst and the screams and looked out the window to see the carnage. 22 people had been killed in the blast. And so heartbroken, Vedran felt called to respond, to do something in response to the tragedy, the horror. But rather than take a reactionary stance, he did what he felt he as an artist could do the next afternoon. Dressed in his formal concert clothes, he took his cello and sat right there in the street where the shell had burst and played Albinoni Adagio in G minor. And the next day and the next, he showed up and played for 22 days. He showed up and played in that spot, one day for each victim of the blast. And then, as the war raged on around him, he kept playing. Swati Chopra, who documented this, wrote about him. He played to ruined homes, smoldering fires, scared people hiding in basements. He played for human dignity that is the first casualty in war. Ultimately, he played for life, for peace, for the possibility of hope that exists even in the darkest hour. And asked by a journalist whether he was crazy for doing what he was doing, Smilovic replied, "You ask me if I am crazy for playing the cello? Why do you not ask if they are crazy for shelling Sarajevo?" This Mother's Day, may we all be mothers of a creative act that pulls us out towards the unknown, out towards the possibility of something beyond a cycle of violence forevermore. May we find something beautiful that pulls our hearts and our guts to action. These closing words from Reverend Dr. Robert McAfee Brown, words shared with me by a beloved colleague, Lindy Ramsden, who joins us sometimes online. None of the concern for beauty is finally a moral cop-out. Concern for beauty is not a moral cop-out. It plunks us firmly down in the midst of where we are. Where there is beauty apparent, we are to enjoy it. Where there is beauty hidden, we are to unveil it. Where there is beauty defaced, we are to restore it. Where there is no beauty at all, we are to create it. May it be so, and amen.